Hello, and welcome back to From the Ground Up, a University of Chicago public policy podcast. I'm Logan Morales, and I'm here with my friends Rand
Hey everyone.
and Christian.
Howdy.
And today we're joined by Rob Labbe, the chair of the board of directors at Mining and Metals Information Sharing Analysis Center, or MM-ISAC for short. Rob, welcome.
G'day, great to be here.
Awesome. So, to get started, can you tell us a bit about your journey and how you came to be the chair of the board of directors at MM-ISAC?
Sure. The Mining Metals ISAC started in Canada 8 years ago now as a result of a series of cyber attacks affecting the mining industry. Within about 2 months, 8 mining companies in Canada were affected. So where MM-ISAC came to be is essentially the security leads of those 8 organizations got together and realized that at some point between number 1 and number 8, it stopped being shame on them, started being shame on us, because it's only through a lack of collaboration and cooperation that these things can happen. So out of that initial group, I was sort of nominated to get things started, becoming the founding chair of MM-ISAC, where I remain currently.
Gotcha. And so we've talked a lot on our podcast about the process of mining itself and the specifics of like mineral to market. But some of our audience might be wondering about how cybersecurity fits into all of this. Could you walk through the importance of it in this industry and what served as like the canary of the mine, if you will, for prioritizing cybersecurity?
So when we think about mining today, it's become increasingly automated, increasingly relying on technology to not only run the business side, but also the mine side. It's technology that increasingly we're depending on to keep the people safe, to keep our mines sustainable, let alone to maintain profitability as grades decrease, as mines get deeper, as mining gets more expensive and more difficult. It's technology we're relying on to keep mines viable and keep producing the commodities the world needs today. So really, when we think about priorities, it's really about protecting the miner's ability to maintain safe production, to keep producing in a way that's safe for people, that way that's safe for the environment, and in a way that maintains profitability and it increases that for the industry so that we can keep producing what we need.
Gotcha. And Christian, do you want to talk about the contemporary scene?
Yeah. So could you provide an overview of the types of cyber threats that mining and metals industry typically face? And how do these threats differ from those in other industries? And why are mining and metals companies particularly targeted?
So, mining and metals companies really face at the base level a lot of the same threats as every other organization. So we've got the most common being things like ransomware that attempt to extort organizations for money. And of course that occurs across all industries. If you've seen the news lately, from healthcare to banks to retail, you name it, somebody in that industry's been hit, made the news. We also see a little bit of espionage activity, most recently in the rare earths segment, where some countries who either want to increase or maintain their market position will steal information to get an advantage over North American or Western European based providers. And the third place where we see threats, again, not unique to mining, is in that geopolitical space. As we know, things, aren't getting simpler in the geopolitical landscape today. Um, I don't think any of us can predict where it's going to be in 5 years, but we know simpler is probably not it. And so when we think about countries that want to impact supply chains, they've got a saying, if it's not grown, it's mined. And so mining sits at the beginning of pretty close to every supply chain. Even when you think about agriculture relies on potash, which is a mined commodity. And so if somebody wanted to disrupt a supply chain broadly, mining's a great place to look to do that. And we've seen some of that on the metal side in Europe, where some Western European metal smelters have been impacted for political reasons. So yeah, that's the sorts of activity we see in mining, which, like I said, isn't in itself different than a lot of other industries. What makes mining a little bit unique is 8, 10 years ago, most mining companies weren't really technology focused. They were at best mining companies who, happened to use technology. That they would email, they would use the web, they would use technology. But the actual mine itself, 10 years ago would have looked very similar to, a mine that, somebody's father or potentially even grandfather might have worked in. In the last 8 years, we've seen the use of technology explode to the point where I would actually describe most major mining companies, rather than mining companies who use technology, as technology companies who happen to dig holes in the ground. Because, mining companies are pioneering the use of automation to run autonomous vehicle fleets, artificial intelligence and machine learning to optimize plant and operations across the board, and are so reliant on technology now that they can't operate if that technology is compromised or tampered with.
Great. So, could you share some of the strategies and or initiatives that you or MMISAC has implemented to meet these challenges?
Yeah, I think the first one is really working with the industry to develop what we call cyber resilience. A few years ago, cybersecurity used to be about preventing the bad people from impacting our operation or making it stop quickly. Now, really, the focus has to be on designing operations that are resilient to cyber attack. So it says, despite our best efforts, we are going to be victims of cyber incidents, and assuming that and engineering that into our design. It's like if you build a building on a hill, you assume it's going to be struck by lightning and you build that into the design, right? When you're building airplanes, you assume components are going to fail and you build that into the design with redundancy. It's the same thing as we're looking at our automated and electronic systems mining. If we assume they're going to be tampered with, if we assume somebody is going to try to compromise them, and we design and architect and engineer that in, then we can be resilient to those attacks, and they won't have the kind of impact we're seeing today.
Could you elaborate more and explain what a ransomware attack is and why it's a significant threat to the mining and metals industry? Specifically, how did the Copper Mountain mine attack exemplify this?
Sure. So, at its core, ransomware really is simply somebody else getting access to your systems and either stealing data and holding it hostage and extorting you. So pay me X amount of money or I'll release it to the world, or encrypting the data and the systems, making it inaccessible to you and demanding money to unlock it and give it back to you, or some combination of both. So, at its core, it's just extortion. And that's basic. Criminal extortion has, existed in this world for as long as we've had money. So that's not new. Where it's interesting in mining, though, is be, in a lot of organizations, particularly smaller miners, the industrial or process control systems are excessively connected to those corporate systems where people are doing email and sending files and what have you. So if there's a ransomware incident, in order to keep production going, you have to be sure that that production system is safe to continue. You know, in Copper Mountain's case, as their press release laid out, they stopped production essentially out of abundance of caution that they couldn't be sure of safe production. And when it comes to safety, if you're not 100% sure you can operate safely, your only option then is to stop, right? There's no, I'm kind of sure, I'm sure-ish, it ought to be okay. You know, there's none of that as an option. It's a binary thing. Either you can operate safely or you cannot. And if you're not sure, the answer is you cannot. And so, that's what we saw at Copper Mountain's case that resulted in, their extended unplanned shutdown of, you know, 3 weeks or so, a little bit less than 3 weeks, because they couldn't be sure of safe production. That's the sort of resilience we talk about that, somebody clicking on an email we wish they wouldn't, shouldn't translate to having to stop production because we're unsure that it's safe.
Could you elaborate more on how the company was able to resume production and the manual processes during that attack that allowed them to do so?
So during the attack, because they had to shut down, they clearly did not have the resilient or the alternate processes that could have allowed for safe production to continue. It was really only after the incident was fully investigated and they could regain the confidence of safe production that they could restart operations. In a more resilient environment, they would have had the processes to quickly validate safe production. They would have had contingency plans and backups so that production could be maintained during that investigation. But in Copper Mountain's case, they clearly did not have that in place.
So, what I imagine that we're driving at is their measures were ineffective. Would you state that as correct?
R- Right. Yeah. So in Copper Mountain's case, whatever measures they might have had in place, and um, I'm not sure what they did or did not have there, but based on results, the measures were ineffective for them.
This past February, you spoke at the mine exchange in Denver, and we spoke of the Copper Mountain mine attack at length in a technical session. And, it was a very vibrant, interesting conversation, I recall. Since then, how have these lessons influenced the cybersecurity strategy of the mining and metals industry?
I think since that incident, there's been, a series of other ones. There have been, other vulnerabilities that have impacted not just those in the mining industry, but those around it, industrial control vendors, auditing firms, things like that. And, looking at those what it really tells us, the pace of these are increasing. And while I don't wanna say it's futile to try to prevent them, the reality is as we require more and more third parties in our environment, they're going to happen. And so I think it's really pushing us as an ISAC to work harder on helping our members become more resilient. It's caused us you know, to nominate a CISO in residence for the ISAC that can provide that strategic guidance, particularly to small mining companies who don't have a chief information security officer of their own. It's really had us double down on that resilience to complement the detection and prevention work we were already doing. It's really bringing the industry to a point where detection and prevention isn't enough anymore. We have to work on the resilience and the recovery.
I wanted to ask one question, Rand, before you take over. You were saying how an investigation had to happen and at Copper Mountain, and that kind of stopped all operations entirely, and they could only resume when they were satisfied that they've concluded it's safe to continue. What are some of those like markers or indicators that they would need to complete an investigation and say, okay, we can continue production?
Really What the forensic investigation would have been an exercise to determine exactly where their attackers got in their network. And they would be looking for conclusive evidence, or at least as close as they could get, that those attackers did not get to the industrial control systems and process control systems at the plant. And if they couldn't get that, they would have had to have rebuilt those systems to ensure they were safe. And I'm not sure which approach Copper Mountain ended up at, whether they got that assurance through the investigation, or if they couldn't, they had to take the time to rebuild those systems. Either kind of fit the timeline. But it's what it speaks to is, in the alternative, if you assume and you engineer for that possibility, then you can maintain production while you're investigating and while you're remediating the incident. I think that's the key lesson there is the need to engineer in resilience to cyber attack and resilience to the process of remediation and investigation so you can continue operations.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Christian, did you have any other questions before we move on?
No, not at this time. Thanks, Rob.
All right,
Excellent.
Rand, do you want to take it away?
Right. So I'm wondering what federal protections are currently in place to ensure cybersecurity for the mining and metals industry. With recent legislation like the Chips and Science Act, a lot of national attention is focused on the importance of these key minerals to our national security. What federal action do you think is needed over the next several years?
So I think there's a couple things. I think to answer the question directly, what is there right now in the United States? Precious little. In the United States, mining of itself is not identified as a whole as a critical infrastructure segment. So it doesn't get the attention and focus from organizations like CISA that other critical infrastructure sectors get. Some parts of mining, if you're a coal miner, you might fall under energy. If you're a steel producer, you might fall under manufacturing. But mining as a whole, it's very fragmented with gaps the size you could drive a haul truck through in the US. But one thing to remember is mining is not a national industry. Most mining companies are global in scope and they're global in nature. So really there's not a lot functionally that a national government can do. It really has to come down to the industry itself. Now, work around, standards for cybersecurity, whether it be requirements that the SEC is looking at around incident reporting and the composition of boards and expertise around cybersecurity will help and will help organizations, build some of that capability. But I think like most industries in mining, it really comes down to it's going to come down to the industry itself globally collaborating and working through this problem. As I said, it's a transnational issue that I struggle for. There's no silver bullet. It's not like the defense industry that really feeds the DoD and the related departments there. That really the Department of Defense can embrace that segment, the defense industrial base, segment in that kind of cloak of protection, such that it is. Mining's a little bit different in terms of global nature. So really, I think it's support would be good, but it really requires Western governments to work together on this.
Yeah. So as follow up, do you think that some of these Western companies might be at a disadvantage? I'm On previous episodes of the show, I've talked a lot about parallels between the industry in China and the United States. And I'm particularly fascinated by the brand of state capitalism that's practiced there, in which government entities, essentially, to oversimplify a little bit, operate and control major corporations in several sectors, including mining. So with that comes greater integration with other state capabilities, such as offensive cyber attacks, and things like that. Do you think that separation in the American or Western context between government capabilities and private sector actions makes these companies more vulnerable or hurts their ability to compete on the world stage?
I think yes and no. I think there's advantages and disadvantages to both. Obviously, in an organization like China, for example, where heavy industry at least is very much integrated with the state apparatus to the point where one could argue any delineation is purely theoretical. You do have the advantage of the state apparatus, be it government or military, intelligence capabilities being deployed to help aid that enterprise. I think one of the advantages mining has at its base, though, is you can, unlike some other sectors, aircrafts, cars, technology, where China's espionage activity can result in copying what gets built in the West and reproduce otherwise. China can't move where the resource is on Earth, right? So if the resource exists in the United States or in Canada or in Australia, well, that's where the mine is going to be, right? No amount of espionage or state action is going to cause that resource to migrate somewhere else. So, that makes it a little bit different from the more intellectual property based industries. So I think the West we can do some protection. We're seeing that legislation in Canada that restricts foreign ownership of strategic mines and minerals so that foreign ownership is put to a national security test before a foreign entity can acquire a significant share, controlling shares in a domestic mine, for example. There's similar rules in Australia. So we've got tools to help protect that domestic industry in in the West that in mining that just won't work in other industries. I think the advantage we have though is because the companies operate more at market, they've got the ability to be creative and innovate and move faster. So I think, that ability to do that compensates, I think, for the whole of country support, I guess, that you'll see in other countries.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Yeah. And a final question from me. What little known risks are out there that might merit more general awareness by the public or by policymakers?
I think in mining, like a lot of industries, I think we're struggling to fully understand and characterize the risks that artificial intelligence is going to bring to the mining industry. I think we're just starting to characterize and understand the potential benefit and upside that AI and the related technologies, particularly generative AI, might bring to mining. But I think we're we're a bit slow to identify potential risks, which will make us even slower to identify countermeasures and controls that we need to put in place to mitigate those. So I think if there's one place where additional investment and support from government might be advantageous or a good place to deploy it, and really not only in mining, but in general to help industry work through the process of understanding the risks and how AI technology that's emerging now can be misused or exploited so that we can develop the security models and the controls um, and the resilience in those systems now before somebody else figures out it ahead of us and we have to do it in a defensive posture. I think emerging, that's the place we need to focus some care and attention over the next couple of years.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rob. I think that's it from us in terms of the direct questions we have for you. I think it's super interesting and important to know about not just what we know we need to do, but also what we know we don't know yet. So the things that do merit more general awareness, the things that we need to improve on in the future. So now we always like to end our podcast with takeaways. So in light of everything we discussed today from the past, present, and future of cybersecurity in the mining industry, do you have a takeaway for us? Something that you want to leave with our audience that they really remember?
I think the big one is in the last, year to year and a half have demonstrated that unfortunately cyber incidents and cyber attacks in this sector and in most sectors are inevitable now. Unfortunately, they're going to happen. However, material impacts, lost production, safety impacts are not inevitable. We have to start architecting and designing and engineering resilience into our operations. And that extends from governance at the board of directors level right through down to the operations. And I think that's the takeaway for this industry is um, build, engineer, and architect in resilience.
Well, Rob, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. Your insights were truly thought provoking, and I appreciate being able to learn from you. Also, thank you to our listeners for tuning in today. If anyone has questions for us or wants to talk about our episodes, please reach out at uc3p from the ground up at gmail.com. Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode.